Fear and trembling in ancient Rome. Hannibal's victory as an alternate history scenario. Crossing the Alps with elephants. Tactics and recklessness that discouraged Roman commanders. A charismatic leader against the mighty empire. (241 BC). The First Punic War between the Roman Empire and Carthage for control over the Mediterranean ended with Carthage's defeat. In the last naval battle, Hamilcar, a brave Carthaginian general and statesman known as Barca, which means lightning, lost half of his 250 ships and had to make peace with the Romans. A few years later, before the military campaign in Spain, he took his 9-year-old son to a temple and had him swear an oath of eternal hostility towards Rome. The boy's name was Hannibal Barca.
The war against the Iberians in Spain lasted for 9 years. In this conflict, Hamilcar died while saving his sons, Hannibal and Hasdrubal. After his father's death, Hannibal remained steadfastly loyal to his childhood oath and became a nightmare for ancient Rome. At 26, he was named commander-in-chief of the Carthaginian forces in Spain. It seemed to the veteran warriors as if the young Hamilcar had returned once more. Not only did he strongly resemble his father, but he also had the same fierce, burning fire in his eyes. Common soldiers loved him for being bold and unpretentious. He was brave in battle, yet far-sighted, easily endured both heat and cold. During campaigns, he often slept on the ground, wrapped tightly in a military cloak.
After the defeat in the First Punic War, Hannibal's homeland was devastated and in dire straits. Apart from having to pay huge war reparations to Rome, Carthage had to deal with an uprising of mercenary armies as they hadn't received their promised wages. Taking advantage of the weakness of Carthage, the Romans, violating the terms of the peace treaty, seized Corsica and Sicily, but Carthage quickly rebounded. The Iberian lands that Hamilcar had annexed to Carthage were rich in woods and silver mines. And Rome didn't like all this. It was afraid of a military alliance between Carthage and the Gauls. To prevent this, the Romans took proactive measures, conquering part of Gaul and capturing the Iberian town of Saguntum, which, according to the peace treaty, was under Carthage's rule.
By then, Hannibal was already planning to declare war on the Romans, and the capture of Saguntum was a good excuse to do so. The siege lasted for 8 months. After the city finally fell, Hannibal began preparing an invasion of the Roman Empire to stop the Roman invasion of Africa. And so began the Second Punic War.
And now let's take a closer look at Carthage. This great port city was founded in the late 9th century BC by adventurous colonists from the Phoenician city of Tyre. By the 3rd century BC, it had become the largest port of the Mediterranean Sea. Carthage boasted a fleet of about 500 ships. Slavery was prevalent in the city. Slaves were extensively used in mines, agriculture, and workshops. The church and the oligarchs were the major slave owners. Power in the state was in the hands of groups of the commercial agricultural aristocracy. Agricultural aristocracy was advocating for the expansion of agricultural holdings in Africa, while merchants were interested in the establishing Mediterranean colonies that would be profitable for transit trade and serve as sources of raw materials for workshops. The top authority was a council of elders, first 10, later 30. Executive power rested with 2 suffets, similar to Roman consuls, while the Senate was the main legislative body. The popular assembly was rarely gathered, only in case of serious disagreement between 2 suffets, when they needed to decide between 2 solutions.
The Carthaginians were excellent sailors, but less skilled as warriors. A significant part of their army was made up of foreign mercenaries, meaning that they fought for money. This made their army less reliable and once led to the mercenary uprising I mentioned earlier. Actually, this was an important distinction between the Roman army, made up of citizens fighting for their homeland, and the Carthaginians.
Carthage was in a military alliance with the steadfast Numidians. These Berber tribesmen were natural-born, skilled horsemen. Numidian horsemen rode without saddles or bridles, efficiently controlling their agile mounts with a simple rope around their horse's neck and a small riding stick, or by using their voice. They were armed with a few javelins and had no armor except for a round leather shield.
The Numidian cavalry wasn't suited for a direct frontal assault against the enemy's heavy cavalry. Therefore, a massive hail of spears rained relentlessly on the Roman infantry from an elevated position. In the midst of the intense pursuit, the swift and agile Numidian cavalry became even more deadly.
Hannibal advanced on the Romans with a massive and well-trained army. The Romans expected him to land on the Apennine Peninsula, and it made sense. But this commander immortalized his name in history with his maneuvers. He did something so incredible that no one could have expected or imagined it. He led his entire army across the treacherous Alps. Hannibal's ambitious plan was to reach northern Italy, where his forces would be joined by many fierce Gauls who hated the Romans. He probably didn't even want to conquer Rome, but planned only to defeat it and impose peace on terms favorable to Carthage. The challenging mountain march across the Alps, with horses and African war elephants, took 16 days. Suddenly, it started to snow, and African warriors, as you can imagine, couldn't tolerate the cold well. It got warmer during the day, so the snow melted and turned into ice, causing some soldiers and animals to fall into mountain canyons. The elephants were starving. Losses during the passage ranged from a third to a quarter of Hannibal's army. Some of the mercenaries and recruits refused to continue their journey and turned back. Out of the 38 elephants, only 15 survived.
Hannibal's truly bold plan worked. He soon ended up in northern Italy, where a large number of Gauls joined his growing army. Not only did it make up for the loss of soldiers in crossing the Alps, but it also increased the overall strength of Hannibal's army. The Romans certainly didn't expect Hannibal's surprise attack from this side. Who would ever think of boldly marching an army and elephants across the Alps? They quickly gathered forces and sent 2 armies to fight him back. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the consul, led one army, and Tiberius Sempronius Longus commanded the other. In the Battle of Ticinus, Hannibal defeated Scipio's army. Scipio himself was severely wounded and saved by his brave son, who was named in his honor. Tiberius Sempronius Longus commanded a strong army of 45,000 men, while Carthage had about 30,000 soldiers. He completely underestimated his enemy and was overly eager for a decisive battle. Here's Hannibal's impressive army, standing on the other bank of the Trebia River. I can't wait to beat them up, Longus thought. But then, the Numidian cavalry raided his camp and caught Tiberius off guard, just as planned. Exactly what Hannibal wanted. The Roman commander hastily rushed after the retreating Numidians and immediately began to move his weary troops across the cold river, without even letting them have breakfast. It was a rainy morning, so the riverbanks were washed out. The Roman soldiers were completely soaked, freezing cold, slogging through the mud. Despite all this, they were able to push the center of the Carthaginian army. Then, unexpectedly, the Carthaginian cavalry and elephants outflanked them. Hannibal made yet another brilliant stride. His warriors appeared from the woods and attacked from behind. That's it. The Romans are defeated, though some part of the Roman army was able to break through the ranks of the Carthaginians and retreat while maintaining their formation. Speaking of elephants, Hannibal's plans for elephants failed. They significantly slowed down the overall speed of his entire army and were extremely difficult to transport across rivers. Actually, they were primarily only used to break the enemy's formation and to intimidate, of course. An elephant can run at speeds of up to 25 miles per hour, but here's the catch. They simply couldn't distinguish between their allies and enemies and were often unpredictable and chaotic in battle. Soon, all of Hannibal's elephants tragically died in battles, and they were frequently and tragically killed by their own riders. Because as soon as they saw the Roman formations, the terrified animals panicked, became completely uncontrollable, and began trampling on the Carthaginian soldiers. About 20,000 Roman soldiers died at the Battle of Trebia, and Hannibal lost roughly 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers. Soon, even more Gauls joined his army, inspired by the Carthaginian commander's victory over the Romans. Moreover, the Gallic tribes supplied the Carthaginian army with provisions, and Hannibal waited out the winter, giving his army a rest. The following spring, he boldly led his army towards central Italy. The Romans once again sent 2 armies against Hannibal. One of them was commanded by Gaius Flaminius. However, despite his big popularity and influence in politics, Roman authors would later portray him as a self-absorbed leader and as an incompetent general. Even though he fought the Gauls before, the same Roman authors claimed that this victory was absolutely not his merit, but that of the brave Roman soldiers. And the second army was commanded by Gnaeus Servilius Geminus.
2 large armies stood in Hannibal's way to Rome. The army of Gnaeus Servilius Geminus stood near Ariminum, and the army of Gaius Flaminius near Arretium.
Gaius Flaminius had an excellent position. Arretium was strategically surrounded by dense forests and marshes, further protected by its reliable and imposing fortress walls. So it seemed like he could easily defeat the Carthaginian army as they crossed. But Hannibal avoided falling into the trap. As he did crossing the Alps, he once again pulled off the unthinkable. With his large army, he went around Arretium through the swampy areas of Clusium. Soldiers marched for 4 days, wading through water and sleeping on the dead horses. During the journey, Hannibal suffered from an eye infection. As a result, he lost his eye and wore a patch for the rest of his life. His exhausted army emerged from the swamps near Lake Trasimeno. Gaius Flaminius was eager to defeat Hannibal and gain all the glory. He didn't wait for the arrival of the second army, and instead decided to pursue the Carthaginians. Looks like Flaminius didn't even realize that he was doing exactly what Hannibal wanted. The Carthaginian commander stationed the main part of his army in the valley, hiding his archers and cavalry on the steep hills at the valley's narrow exit. The Roman forces entered the valley at dawn, cautiously advancing slowly inward. Due to the morning fog, they only saw the Carthaginian troops when they encountered their infantry. Meanwhile, the cavalry suddenly attacked them from their ambush, blocking the valley exit. The trap snapped shut! The Romans didn't even have time to reorganize their battle formations due to the challenging terrain, yet they fought bravely for 3 hours. A large part of the Roman army perished, with several thousand soldiers taken captive. So, some desperately attempted to escape by swimming, but many drowned. When the second consul found out that Flaminius couldn't wait any longer, he quickly sent him 4,000 warriors as reinforcements. They too were either killed or captured. Undoubtedly, the Battle of Lake Trasimeno became one of the most significant ambushes in military history. After the victory in the battle, Hannibal gained control of Etruria, so the road to Rome lay open.
Meanwhile, in the Eternal City, when they found out about the battle's outcome, everyone was horrified. In a military emergency, the Roman Popular Assembly elected Quintus Fabius Maximus as a sole dictator. The Roman Senate was in session day and night, working out a rescue plan. They destroyed the bridges across the Tiber, fortified the walls and towers of Rome, prepared their ships, formed 2 new legions, and mobilized the auxiliary forces.
The Romans expected a major battle, but Quintus Fabius Maximus, who was afraid of Hannibal's military genius, was like, whoa, no thanks guys, but we'll handle it differently. Hannibal is tearing us to pieces. So here's the strategy. No more big battles ever. We'll quickly wear down the Carthaginians with a series of minor skirmishes. Also, Roman forces employed a scorched earth policy. They burned down houses and crops along Hannibal's troop routes, evacuating all people to safer cities. Confronted with these overwhelming challenges, Hannibal was forced to stop his advance towards Rome and headed to the south of Italy. Along the way, he fell into a devastating pitfall.
The army found itself in the lowlands, while the surrounding mountains and hills were occupied by Quintus Fabius Maximus's forces. Hannibal took a calm breath, thought for a minute, and ordered his soldiers to have dinner and go to bed early. In the morning, he assembled a small group, gave them 2,000 bulls obtained from locals, and tied firewood to the bulls' horns. Imagine you're a Roman, sitting still on guard duty, and in the dark of night, thousands of lights are rushing towards you. The soldiers couldn't handle this kind of psychological pressure, so they fled. When they realized that these were just frightened bulls with burning hay on their horns, Hannibal quickly sent his army through the passage and broke free. By that time, Carthaginian forces struggled with supply issues, lacked weaponry, received minimal reinforcements, and the soldiers' morale was low.
In 216 BC, Hannibal successfully managed to take the city of Cannae, which had abundant and substantial food supplies. At the same time, Quintus Fabius Maximus's cautious tactics earned him the nickname of a coward. As his 6-month term was coming to an end, the Romans were like, "Listen, this dictator isn't doing us any good. Let's bring back the consuls." And so they did. The Romans, along with their allies, assembled a massive army hoping to crush Hannibal. There were hardly any families left in the Eternal City whose members hadn't gone to war. Romans made sacrifices and vows, praying to their gods to spare their loved ones. But at that moment, their very worst nightmare quickly came true. The Roman forces totaled 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Opposing them was a Carthaginian army of roughly 40,000 heavy infantry and 10,000 cavalry in the battle itself. The two armies met at Cannae. The Roman forces were led by the consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. The Carthaginian army formed a line. Hannibal advanced Spanish and Gallic light infantry from the center, forming an arc. The Romans struck at the center of this line, while the Carthaginian cavalry attacked the flanks and the infantry rear. The arc transformed into a crescent, and the Republic's army, being completely surrounded, was almost destroyed. Hannibal's victory was really absolute. It greatly strengthened the position of Carthage and dramatically changed the geopolitical balance of power in the world. Rome was left without an army. Macedonia, Syracuse, and nearly all the cities in the south and north of Italy joined the Carthaginian side.
Lucius Aemilius Paulus died in the battle, while Gaius Terentius Varro managed to survive and return to Rome, where he reported the defeat to the Senate. Almost every Roman household was mourning for the dead, and the day of the defeat at the Battle of Cannae was forever remembered in Roman history. Grief-stricken and trembling with fear, everyone expected Hannibal to come to the Eternal City. For the last time in Roman history, human sacrifices were made. Citizens were preparing for a siege, but it never happened. Hannibal, one of Hannibal's comrades and the commander of his cavalry, told him right after the Battle of Cannae, "You know how to win, but you don't know how to take advantage of it." Suddenly, unstoppable Hannibal declined to besiege Rome, a mere few days away, about 185 miles.
He knew that the Romans were preparing for a siege. While Hannibal was skilled in battles, his siege experience was truly limited, only 2 out of 5. The siege of Saguntum alone took him 8 months. Hannibal's army notably lacked essential siege equipment, faced persistent supply issues, and its numbers were simply insufficient for a successful siege of a city as massive as Rome. By throwing all his forces into the siege, he could inevitably lose control over his already conquered cities and eventually be completely surrounded by his enemy's army. The situation was a stalemate. For the next 10 years, Hannibal, along with his loyal army, steadily wandered back and forth across the Apennine Peninsula. The soldiers' morale gradually declined, and his allies were getting frustrated. Reinforcements from Carthage were extremely scarce as the Romans dominated the seas, and the Carthaginian Senate thought it was more important to protect the territories they had conquered in Spain. Meanwhile, the Romans steadily built up their army, weakening Hannibal's forces by taking cities in small campaigns, cutting off Carthaginian supply bases and strategically important strongholds. They began gradually putting pressure on the Carthaginian troops in Spain and eventually landed in Africa to directly attack Carthage. The mighty Roman army was led by a young commander, the very son of Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had saved his father after his defeat by Hannibal's forces at the Battle of Trebia that I briefly mentioned earlier. Scipio was now 31 years old. He had previously defeated Carthaginian forces in Spain. The Carthaginian Senate was pretty much like, "Hey Hannibal, leave Italy. Come to us. Things are getting hot here." Scipio is approaching, and Hannibal returned to Carthage. He arrived in the Roman camp to negotiate more favorable peace terms with Scipio, but Scipio refused.
Scipio had been at war with the Carthaginians since his youth. His father and uncle died in battles against Carthaginian forces in Spain, and he himself survived the Battle of Cannae by a stroke of luck. He resembled a younger Hannibal in many ways. He was diligent, calculating, and popular with his soldiers. From a young age, he studied all of Hannibal's battles, closely observing his every move, and understood Hannibal's tactics and strategies like no one else. Barca didn't realize that his best student was in front of him, obsessed with the idea of Carthage's downfall.
By successfully convincing the Numidian king to ally with the Romans, he left Hannibal without much of his Numidian cavalry. The following day marked the official start of the last battle of the Second Punic War between Scipio's forces and those of Hannibal. The strengths of both sides were about equal. This time, the Numidian cavalry fought on the side of the Romans, giving them a significant advantage in cavalry. Despite this, Hannibal had a superiority in infantry, and once again, there were war elephants on his side. Hannibal ordered the elephants to charge, but relying on them was a truly grave mistake. In the conflicts with the Romans in Spain, the Carthaginians had already lost many war elephants, and the ones left were young and poorly trained. Scipio saw it coming and had his soldiers meticulously organized in this unusual chess-like formation. So the elephants attacked, and the soldiers shifted to the sides, creating corridors. The elephants dashed forward, running into a barrage of arrows and darts from the flanks. Suddenly, the Roman battle horns blared. The animals got frightened, and they ran back, trampling their own front line. The Carthaginian cavalry fiercely backed the massive elephant attack, but the more numerous Roman and Numidian cavalry successfully pushed them back and immediately started pursuing. Hannibal tried to pull off his signature battle move, hitting the flanks of the Roman infantry with the most battle-hardened elite squads of his veterans. But Scipio foresaw this too. He had wisely positioned Roman veterans on his flanks as well. The clash between these elite warriors was fierce and lasted for about 2 intense hours. During this time, the Carthaginians started pressing the Romans in the center, and luck began to favor them more and more. However, the Roman and Numidian cavalry suddenly hit the Carthaginian infantry from behind. Unable to withstand the pressure, the Carthaginian army broke and ran. The Carthaginians were utterly defeated, and Hannibal narrowly managed to escape. After the Battle of Zama, Scipio earned the nickname Africanus. That's how he forever went down in history, Scipio Africanus. The defeat at the Battle of Zama led Carthage to make peace on even more unfavorable terms with the Romans than they had been forced to make after the First Punic War. Carthage lost Spain, and the valuable islands in the Mediterranean had to pay massive war reparations to Rome for 50 long and difficult years. Couldn't wage wars without Rome's permission, and most importantly, it lost its entire fleet, except for a symbolic 10 ships. And this, as you can imagine, severely undermined their major source of power.
Unable to continue the war with the Romans, Hannibal went into politics and became the head of the Carthaginian Senate. He initiated numerous economic and political reforms aimed at improving Carthage's economic situation and restoring its military power. These reforms, however, earned him many enemies among the Carthaginian aristocracy, and he was eventually forced to flee to avoid being sent to the Romans. For many years, he lived at the courts of rulers of states hostile to the Roman Empire, serving as an expert on combating the Republic. Romans, in turn, feared Hannibal and pursued him relentlessly. He died in 183 BC, likely by poisoning himself, after being betrayed by King Prusias of Bithynia, with Roman soldiers surrounding his residence. The same year, Scipio, the man who had defeated Hannibal and earned the title of Africanus after the victory, also passed away from illness.
Hannibal remained undefeated. At the time, his figure was so monumental that even the Romans paid tribute to Hannibal as a great military leader and a worthy adversary and opponent. There is a legend that during his stay in the Syrian city of Ephesus, after being expelled from Carthage, Hannibal met Scipio Africanus once. They talked just like old friends, briefly putting aside personal grudges. You see, if Carthage had supported Hannibal, the Roman Empire could hardly have survived, and then history would have taken a different turn. The complex political structure of Carthage and constant internal conflicts prevented that from happening. Otto Bismarck admired the talents of the Carthaginian commander and wrote about him the following: "As to the transcendent military genius of Hannibal, there cannot be two opinions. The man who for 15 years could hold his ground in a hostile country against several powerful armies and a succession of able generals must have been a highly skilled commander and a brilliant tactician of supreme capacity and intelligence. In the use of brilliant strategies and well-planned ambuscades, he certainly surpassed all other generals of antiquity. Wonderful as his achievements were, we must marvel the more when we take into account the limited and grudging support he received from Carthage throughout his campaigns. He had indeed bitter enemies, and his life was one continuous struggle against destiny. For unwavering steadfastness of purpose, for organizing capacity, and a mastery of military science, he has perhaps never had an equal. Initially, Hannibal himself boldly initiated the war with Rome, sought out allies on his own, raised crucial funds to maintain his army, and recruited mercenaries who remained loyal not to Carthage, but to their commander. Indeed, he firmly and effectively controlled his diverse army, made up of people from different nations and cultures. Actually, it truly seems like the war with Rome was his personal and unwavering battle. His homeland didn't particularly need these victories, and so didn't provide him with much support. They called upon him for help urgently when the Romans invaded Africa, posing a direct and immediate threat to Carthage. The only battle Hannibal ever truly lost was the Battle of Zama, and that too for the most part happened because the Numidian king eventually switched sides. Never before had Rome been so close to complete destruction as during the Second Punic War. Never again until the fall of the Roman Empire under the onslaught of the barbarians did the Romans have to face such a dangerous enemy as Hannibal's disciplined and powerful army. After half a century had passed, during the devastating Third Punic War, the Romans captured and completely wiped Carthage out, fulfilling the call of the Roman statesman: Carthage must be utterly destroyed.
I can't